Hey, welcome back to the show. I'm here with Nolan Erck, and we're going to be talking about ColdFusion and Angular. And we're going to look at why you might want to use those both together. And we'll also start off with a refresher of what Angular is and the differences between Angular 1 and Angular 2. And also talk a bit about ColdFusion APIs. So welcome, Nolan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. And if you don't know Nolan, he is the chief ColdFusion guru at South of Shasta Productions. And he's been doing programming for more than 20 years and started off doing game programming, but now he's been doing ColdFusion and other web development for quite a while. And he just came back from Germany where he was speaking at CF Camp on ColdFusion and Angular.
I did.
So I think we should just start off for folks who don't know what Angular is. What is Angular?
Okay, so Angular is one of the growing piles of JavaScript frameworks that are getting really popular these days. Like the other ones, Vue.JS and React. The basics of what Angular does is it gives you a model view controller structure for your JavaScript applications. The more people are relying on JavaScript to build modern web development, to have more than just a typical request response sort of behavior in their applications, more functionality is going into JavaScript than used to be there maybe 5-10 years ago. And people are writing tons more JavaScript now. Therefore, they need lots more organization of that JavaScript. And that's where these JavaScript frameworks come into play. And Angular is one of the current handful of really popular frameworks to help give you that structure to your front-end applications.
Okay, so if you were not going to use Angular, what are the competing frameworks? Is jQuery or React? Or
jQuery kind of, you could make an argument for jQuery being a similar kind of framework. I think of that more as for doing what I'll call UI candy in your websites. Not really a full-on structured MVC framework, but I guess there might be a way to sort of shoehorn jQuery into doing that. Some more closely, some more similar frameworks might be things like Vue.JS. That's a really popular one right now. React is another popular one that a lot of people like. There's one called Ember. And there's probably several others that people are going to be wildly offended that I'm not thinking of at the moment. But those are kind of the main ones I mostly hear about in conversation. Would be Angular, Vue, and React would be the main ones right now.
Okay.
And Ember.
And do you prefer Angular over the others? Or
honestly, no. They all sort of have different things that irritate me a little bit along the way. It sort of depends on what the clients and the project needs for that particular application. If there's already code in place, sometimes we'll factor that in to decide, okay, we're going to use Angular for this one or Vue.js or something else. No, honestly, I don't think there's a perfect front-end framework. They all have things they do well, and they all have things that, as I get in and start writing code, bug me in one way or another.
Okay, well, maybe we'll get into some of the things that bug you later. But I think that, now we know that Angular is a front-end thing. What would the use cases be for why you'd want to include Angular in your web app?
Really, you'd include it for building what I would call modern websites. People are moving, the current design firms and the more modern design agencies, the more modern looking websites, they're veering off of what I'll call the traditional request response sort of layout. So in a typical ColdFusion app, you might have like a header and a footer.cfm file, or maybe a custom tag, or even better, you might have an MVC framework like ColdBox that gives you a header and footer around your website, and you inject the page content into each individual page. And every time you click a link in that website, the entire header and the entire footer and all the stuff in between gets sent from the server back down to the browser. And there's a lot of repetitive data being sent back and forth that way. The header on a website doesn't change between page to page to page on the site. So if I click 10 different links on a website, all of that header code, all of that JavaScript and graphics and whatever else gets resent down to the browser every time. And yeah, there's like caching you can turn on in your browser, but basically the same thing is happening. The request is requesting the entire website to come back down every time you click a link. What people are finding is you can get rid of that phenomenon, have everything sucked down to the browser once, and essentially unplug the server and have it all run inside the browser. There's enough power and functionality in modern web browsers to do a lot more things on the client side than there used to be. So we don't need to do a fresh call of everything off of the server and bring it back down to the browser every time like we used to have to do maybe 5-10 years ago. Combine that with so many people are surfing the web now on their mobile devices, their iPhones and their tablets, and they want an experience that just is more engaging than a traditional website might have been, in the early 2000s. So you do a lot more heavy JavaScript animation and a lot more JavaScript functionality just to make sort of Ajax style things happen in your website a lot, rather than the entire page refreshing every time you click a link. Maybe only, part of the page refreshes if that's where the new data is based on what you've clicked in the site, and leave the header and footer and the side nav all stays exactly the same. And you have more of an application style experience in your website and less of a web page after web page sort of experience. And that's where a framework like Angular comes into play. It makes it really easy to build that application style functionality into what was traditionally a website or a web page.
So basically, this is going to replace all the UI code that you would have written in HTML.
Not really, no. So you'll still use HTML tags just like you did before. You'll still use CSS just like you did before. In fact, if people are familiar with things like Bootstrap for their CSS, you can use Bootstrap inside your Angular applications, and that all works exactly the same as it did previously. What's going to change is when you click on a link in that web page, it's not going to go up to the server again and pull down an entire new web page. It's going to just stay within the client-side browser, and if it needs new data from the server, rather than grabbing an entire new web page and bringing that down, it's going to talk to maybe a server-side API and just grab the bits of JSON data that it needs and bring that down, instead of an entire web page with a header and a footer and redoing all the graphics and so on.
So this is basically what you'd have hand-coded using Ajax maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But it kind of does all the complicated stuff for you.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I guess, Ajax on steroids would be a good way to think about it. We've got that Ajax-style functionality that we had with kind of vanilla JavaScript 10 years ago, or with something like jQuery, as well as the organization of a full-blown framework like you would have on the ColdFusion side from something like Framework 1 or ColdBox. And you get that all, though, in your browser at the JavaScript level.
So I guess the next question for me is, if you're new to Angular, how long does it take to get up to speed so you can start using it effectively?
That's a good question. So there's two types of Angular that are out there right now. There's Angular 1, which is also called AngularJS, and there's Angular 2 and above. I think they're on version 6 right now. 7 might have just been released, somewhere around the version 6 ballpark. Angular 1, or AngularJS, is really, really easy to start using. If you're not familiar with JavaScript frameworks, if you've only used vanilla JavaScript and maybe jQuery, Angular 1 is an easier way to go. You can, just like jQuery, where you drop a jQuery.js file into your website, and then you can start doing jQuery things. Angular works in a very similar fashion. You drop an AngularJS file into your website with a script source equals tag, and then you can turn on Angular and start doing things with it. Angular 2 and above is more of an involved process. You have to download Node.js. There are various command line tools you have to type to get your JavaScript app to compile. Angular 2 and above is much more of kind of a classic or desktop app kind of experience. If you're building like a Java or C++ app, you have to compile that code, and that compiled code gets outputted to a binary file or a distribution folder of some kind, and that compiled stuff is what actually runs on your computer. Angular 2 and above is similar to that. You take all of your, in fact, you don't even write JavaScript in Angular 2 and above. You write TypeScript. You run that TypeScript through an Angular compiler. That turns the TypeScript into JavaScript, and then that JavaScript is what actually gets run in your browser. So Angular 1 would be the easier way to go for people that are brand new to doing modern MVC front-end development. I brought this up at the, so when I gave this talk in Germany, the demos that I gave in my talk were using Angular 1, and there was a comment from the room. They asked, why are you using the older version of it? Isn't that basically dead? The short answer is no, it's not actually dead yet. Yes, they are whipping out new versions of Angular every few months. I mean, they're up to version 6 already. Google has already said they will support Angular 1 up through the middle of 2020. So for the next almost 2 years, if jQuery comes out with something that breaks Angular, they'll fix it. If a modern web browser, Firefox and Chrome, etc., come out with a new version and that breaks Angular 1, they'll fix that as well. And if they discover any security problems within Angular 1, they'll fix that too. So there is decent support for it for at least the next roughly 2 years. And that's just Google's official support. I mean, the code is not going to just magically stop working the day that Google says, okay, we're done writing Angular 1 code. That's not the way technology works. I mean, it's possible that a future update in a browser could come out and break something, but that's not part of the current workflow or roadmap that anyone has in front of them. So I like Angular 1 for people that are brand new to doing this. You can build MVC apps with it. You can talk to server-side APIs. You can do all of the MVC type of stuff that are basically the reasons you would start using a framework anyway. And then once you're comfortable with that, and once you have something you want, if you do it to a point where you feel like, okay, it's time to look at Angular 2 and above, then go ahead and switch gears and you can rebuild your app doing something like that. The good thing about Angular 1 is it's really easy to start using. The bad thing about Angular 1 would be when you move to Angular 2 and above, it's an entire reboot. The code you wrote for Angular 1 pretty much all has to be rewritten to use Angular 2 and above. The nice thing, though, is if you write it the Angular 2 way, going from version 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, actually there is no 3, excuse me, but 2 to any of the other versions above it, 5 or 6 or whatever, those are all really, really similar. So the pain point is going from 1 to 2. And then once you're on the version 2 type of Angular app, after there, it's pretty much like differences in Java or .NET or ColdFusion, where the core language is the same. They just add new functionality here and there. They add a couple of new functions, maybe move code from one library to another. So a couple of your config files need to change a tiny bit, but that's the gist of it. So that's kind of I would start with Angular 1 for people that are brand new to MVC. If you're comfortable with Node, if you're comfortable with MVC frameworks, if you like learning new languages, especially if you like things that are typed like .NET or C++, then check out Angular 2 and above and go with one of those. And
you mentioned it's written in TypeScript for Angular 2. Is that like pretty similar to JavaScript, or is it a whole new language? Or
it's a little of both. So TypeScript can do everything JavaScript can do, plus a whole bunch of stuff wrapped around the outside of it. So all of the JavaScript syntax people are familiar with, the alert statement, if statements, an array, a for loop, writing your own functions, all of that stays the same in TypeScript. And then what they did is they wrapped a whole bunch of stuff around the outside of it that gives you basically a typed language on top of JavaScript. It looks to me very similar to things like .NET or C#. So one of the nice things about a language like ColdFusion is I can make a variable called first name, and I can stick the word Nolan in it, and it's just fine. And 20 lines of code later, I can take first name and set it equal to a number, 75. And JavaScript will let me, ColdFusion will let me change data types in a variable without complaining at all. It's a very loosely typed language. And JavaScript is similar in that regard. I can swap different types of data in and out of a variable, and overall, it's fine. There's a couple of, situations where it's not, but generally it's a loosely typed language. And what TypeScript lets you do is in JavaScript, you can have strongly typed functionality on things. So if I don't want the variable to change from a string to an integer to an array to something else, I want to mark it as this variable is only going to hold an array of integers, or this variable is only going to hold a string. I can do that sort of thing with TypeScript. And it's much more of like a compiled process, similar to like C++ or Java would be. Some of the upsides to that, you get typed behavior. And for people like me that come from a C++ background, sometimes that's just an easier mindset to get into when building larger applications. It can also help you get rid of some types of errors in your app if you accidentally pass the wrong type of data into a function. In JavaScript, you won't really know that until you run the code and see it blow up in front of, hopefully in your test lab, but not in front of the client. Whereas with the TypeScript application, a lot of that sort of checking happens at compile time. So I can actually get those errors in my editor while I'm writing code, as opposed to after it's been deployed out to a server and you know, a client sees it or what have you. So
probably a good thing, because some errors don't show up until that particular piece of code gets exercised. So.
Exactly, yeah. And that's not to say that TypeScript is perfect. You still have the possibility of runtime errors. It's just the strongly typed behavior in it helps get rid of some of that sort of problem, and helps kind of make it easier to wrap your mind around what type of data is this code going to be handling. Everything isn't just the word var all the way down the page like it would be in a JavaScript app. You can have actual types next to your variables. This is a string. This is a person's name. This is an array of email addresses, whatever the types are that you're dealing with.
Now, I noticed that Jeffry Hauser has a new book out on Angular and ColdFusion. Angular 7 Bootstrap and ColdFusion Enterprise Application Development. So I'm guessing Angular 7 must be just about to come out.
Yeah, I've seen little bits of news about Angular 7. I haven't looked at it yet myself. I'm still using version 5 for current projects I'm working on. They crank them out pretty regularly. I haven't actually read Jeffrey's book yet either. I'll have to check that out. I didn't know that was coming out.
Yeah, well, he had one on Angular, previous versions of Angular. I think he just updated it for Angular 7. So
nice.
Yeah. So, okay, so we talked about Angular 1 and Angular 2 and TypeScript, but you mentioned Node.js. Tell us a little bit about what that is, because you've got to install that as well to get this working.
You do, yeah. So on the ColdFusion side, I'm going to compare it to ColdFusion for a minute here. On the ColdFusion side, in modern CFML development, one of the default tools everybody should just have installed at this point in their career is CommandBox. And CommandBox, among a bunch of other things, what it lets you do is it gives you command line ColdFusion specific tools. So you can do things from the command line, like turn on a ColdFusion server running CF11 with this particular patch installed. And then within one command of the command line, I can turn that off and turn on a Lucy 5 engine with one particular patch installed. And then I can test my code across multiple CFML engines that way. It also lets me talk to the package registry, ForgeBox, which is where a lot of open source reusable chunks of CFML code exist that other people in the community have written. You can download that code and use it for whatever the project is you're working on. And Node.js is the same thing for the JavaScript community. It's command line JavaScript type tools. It gives you various bits of functionality at the command line to do JavaScript-ish things. One of them is, just like in ColdFusion, we have the ForgeBox registry. In JavaScript or Node land, they have the NPM registry. It stands for Node Package Management. And that's the space where people have written lots of reusable chunks of JavaScript. And using Node, I can type a few things at the command line and say, please go get that package of JavaScript code and download it to my current project and make it available for use in the app that I'm building. So one of the different packages that you can download from Node is the Angular 2 tool set. So you would actually the way you start using Angular 2 and above is you download Node.js, and then you'll type a Node command to say, Node, go please install Angular, let's say Angular 7, since that's a new one. Node, go please install Angular 7 for me. And it will go out to the NPM registry out in the cloud. It will grab the particular files, copy them down to your machine, and set them up ready for use. And once that's done, you will then have a couple of new command line tools you can type on your laptop that turn on different Angular things. You can do things like ng, which is how Angular commands all begin. It's ng for Angular and then a space and whatever the command is. So you can say ng create a new skeleton of a new Angular application. And when I want to compile that TypeScript and turn it into JavaScript, I can say ng build, and it will actually compile all of my TypeScript and turn it into the JavaScript for me. When I want to set up a very basic HTTP web server to look at that Angular code and see that it's running properly, I can type ng serve, and it will actually turn on a very lightweight HTTP server on my laptop and load that code up into the localhost web server, so I can see the code and test it, make sure it works properly. And there are a few other Angular commands you get with the command line. But yeah, to do Angular 2 and above, you pretty much have to have Node installed. But honestly, that's becoming kind of a standard thing in development these days too, is just if you're doing modern web development, whether it's Angular, Vue, pretty much anything dealing with modern front-end web development of some sort or another, it's kind of expected that you'll have Node installed on your machine now to do package management, to do any number of things, to run gulp and grunt tasks, all kinds of stuff.
So you don't have to write code in Node.js. It's just so you can run Angular too.
Exactly, yeah. You don't have to, it's just a thing you'll install, and then you'll have to type, let's say, a handful of Node or Angular commands on your command line to get things to install and start running. But beyond that, you don't have to learn Node.js to do those basic things.
And Node.js is just a way of running JavaScript on your server. So that's all it's doing.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's kind of the thing that hooks the Angular front end to the back end and does all the asynchronous calls.
You could, or you could use ColdFusion to do your backend calls, and use something like Taffy or ColdBox REST to do that. The Node thing, when you use Node to build your Angular apps, you don't actually have to put Node on your server. You just have to have Node on your laptop where you're writing code to build your Angular app. Yeah. So for instance, I have a ColdFusion server that all my clients have their websites on, and it doesn't have Node on it anywhere. My laptop, however, has Node installed on it. So when I make a new project, I run various Node and Angular commands on the laptop to build the Angular application. And then once that's done, I take whatever the output is from that project and move it up to the ColdFusion server where it runs like a normal web application would.
Okay, yeah, so Angular...
Sorry, go ahead.
Angular can talk to several backends, and we're going to use it with ColdFusion, but it could talk with a Java backend or PHP or Node or anything, really, as long as it can send REST requests or whatever format you're sending.
Exactly, yeah. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a REST request. It can be any URL you have for any web server. As long as that web server hands back JSON, the Angular app can talk to it. It could be written in .NET, PHP, ColdFusion, Java. It could be a COBOL backend if you had some way to do that and spit out JSON. It could be whatever you want, as long as it's got a URL that the Angular app can connect to, and that URL returns JSON, the Angular app has everything it needs. I think technically it can also read XML, but there's a couple of extra steps involved in getting the XML, and inside the Angular app, you'll eventually turn the XML into into JSON anyway. So most people, just have a URL that hands back JSON, whatever URL, whatever backend technology you want to power that URL, CFML, Java, and the Angular app doesn't know that the backend is written in ColdFusion. It doesn't know that it's written in PHP or whatever else. It doesn't care. It just knows, here's the URL. I'm going to talk to that, get back the data in the format that I want, and the code continues running. Okay,
so of course, this being the CF Live podcast, we're going to want to use ColdFusion for the back end.
Right.
So why do ColdFusion and Angular work well together? Or do they?
They do. They work really well together. Angular works pretty well with whatever you want to set up your backend to use. The nice thing about ColdFusion is we've got several different easy options for building your backend API. If you've got what I'll call a modern CFML backend and you want to do things like a RESTful web service, there are a couple of options that are really easy to go with. There are some bits of baked-in functionality in ColdFusion. I want to say 11 and above. It might be 2016 and above. I think it's 11 and above. There are some features baked into Adobe CF to turn on a REST backend. There's also the ColdBox folks have a tool they've written called ColdBox REST that makes it really easy to build a REST API in ColdBox and have that return JSON back to whatever app you have. There's also an open source package called Taffy that works on a variety of ColdFusion engines, Lucy and Adobe CF. And that's a free open source thing. You can download it from taffy.io. There's a tiny bit of server configuration involved in getting Taffy to run, but that works just fine. And for people that are on maybe a little bit of an older CFML tech stack, or their app is a little bit kind of long in the tooth, they've still got kind of some .cfm files that are lingering around, maybe a couple of CFCs, but it's not like a full structured, well-organized MVC app. There's still things we can do in those situations to return JSON back to the Angular app too. You can just use functions like serialize JSON. You can basically tack that onto the bottom of any .cfm file, turn whatever variable you want into JSON, and then output that at the bottom of your file, and that will output JSON. And as far as the Angular app is concerned, it got back the JSON it wanted. It talked to an API. The Angular app doesn't care that the app might have been like written 10 years ago and maybe the code is still terrible in some spots. It'll all work just fine. You can also do tricks like with, if you have CF components and you want to talk to a particular method inside a component, instead of going to sitename.com/some CFM file, you can go to sitename.com/ whatever your CFC name is. So let's say user service.cfc !, method equals, and then put the name of your CF function. And that URL will actually call that function and output whatever the results are right there on the screen. You can tack a second URL parameter on there. So you can say !, method equals, function name, ampersand, return format equals JSON, and whatever the output from that function is will automatically be turned into JSON and sent back that way too. So I can have URLs that talk directly to CFCs in my app. Those URLs will automatically return JSON. I don't have to change any code at all in my ColdFusion layer. It just magically does it based on that return format equals JSON being stuck in the URL. And then my Angular app has the API it needs.
Well, that sounds really easy to do.
It is. It's really easy. And it works for super well organized modern CFML engines all the way over to, I wrote this app 10 years ago and I didn't know what I was doing, and it's kind of, funky in spots, but I need to make it talk as an API right now without changing a whole lot of code, and everything in between.
Okay. So just stepping back and looking at the big picture here, basically you've got the UI that's collecting information. It wants to probably query the database or put it into a database or do some kind of calculation. And it's calling the back end to give that information or make those calculations or the business logic. And then that's being sent back to the Angular front end to display it in a pretty way. Is that the gist of what's going on here?
Pretty much, yeah. I think the one change I might make to that statement would be the business logic that we used to historically think of as that has to happen in the ColdFusion and for power and performance and such. A lot of that can now happen on the front end in the JavaScript Angular side because modern browsers are so powerful and the MVC frameworks can do so much for us too. You can have a lot of business logic happen in the JavaScript layer. But yeah, at the end of the day, JavaScript still cannot talk to a database directly. You have to push that up to the cloud somehow to get it into your database. And that's where the ColdFusion API would come into play. So you could do like your validation, some of your validation anyway. You could do various business rules in your app at the JavaScript layer if you wanted to. And then when the user finally hits, let's say, the save user button, when the JavaScript is ready to say, okay, now I want to save this to a database, it can then make a call to the ColdFusion API to push that data up to the server and say, okay, save this to the database. And then your ColdFusion layer will actually do the CF query, insert into table name code and stay before you.
Okay, well, makes sense. How do you deal with security in this? I mean, if the Angular front end is writing directly to the CFCs, couldn't someone else kind of fake that out somehow?
You could. That's a good question. So yeah, you could. I guess you deal with it the same way you would deal with a modern a CFML app, even if it wasn't Angular on the back end. You have things like you would have to write some sort of code in your ColdFusion app. Let's pretend it's 10 years ago. We're not using Angular. We just have a regular ColdFusion app. You'd still have function calls in your code that say, before I save this record into the database, make sure the user is logged in. Make sure it's a valid user that's logged in. Make sure they have the credentials to actually do whatever it is they're trying to do. And then if they pass all those rules, then you say, okay, go ahead and run this save into the database. And it's no different really with a modern web app. You'll have to do some sort of basically handshake between when people log into the Angular app. The Angular app will do some sort of talking to the API saying, I have a user here that's logged in. Give me some sort of token I can pass between the ColdFusion side and the Angular side so that you know this is me and not some random person on the other side of the planet trying to hack the website. And you'll basically do that sort of handshake process between the two in one of several different ways. You'll pass some sort of magic number back and forth, or use browser cookies or use whatever combination of things works for the application you're doing. Yeah, you'll have to. There are some design concerns for sure in building an app like this, but that's true of any web app really that has to have security around it. So it shouldn't be that different to web developers to worry about security than what they've dealt with before.
Right. No, that makes sense. I just think it's good to always be aware of security when doing a ColdFusion or any web app.
Yeah, I'm kind of giving the 5-second answer of that now, just because we could go on a whole tangent on different ways to secure your app, and we'd be here all night.
Yes. Well, that can be a talk for another day.
Exactly.
I'm sure that's because sometimes these sites. I mean, I think when British Airways got hacked, didn't they? Someone managed to inject some JavaScript into their front end that kind of faked out or recorded the credit cards being run through Stripe, or there was some weird stuff that someone managed to get in there. I think they injected it through some form that got saved. That's
possible. I don't remember the details of that particular attack, but yeah, that sounds like something that could have happened through JavaScript.
Well, they only lost 300,000 credit cards, so
Is that all? Fine.
Yeah, probably wasn't that big a deal.
Right.
So let's just talk a little bit about architecture here. Are there any design patterns that fit well for this, or can you do it? You mentioned you could just take CFCs you wrote 10 years ago and retrofit them for this, but would it be better to use a particular design pattern? Or?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways that are probably better than others to do it. Like if you're really in a bind and you have a legacy CF app, you have to turn into an API now. The quick and dirty way to do it would be just at the bottom of your .cfm file, place a call to serialize JSON, stick the variable in there, and then whatever that outputs, you return that to the browser, and that's essentially your API. That's not a great design that will get you by in a pinch if you have to. Really, at this point, what I would recommend is either Taffy, if that looks like something people want to use, or probably even better at this point would be the ColdBox REST API. They both do the same kind of thing. They're both a skeleton to use to build your API layer in ColdFusion. They both provide a dashboard to show you what the different API endpoints are in your app. They're both free. They're both open source. They both work on all the different web servers that are out there. The difference, I guess, would be the Ortus guys. It's a team of the Taffy was written by one person, Adam, and he's awesome. He knows APIs and REST and all that sort of stuff backwards and forwards. He's written a great book about it called Rest Assured that I recommend everyone check out. The Ortus product is it's written by a team of people. So there's, I don't know how many people are on the Ortus team right now. Let's say 5, probably more than that. There's just more people there that can answer questions if you get stuck on something. And they're a little bit more heavily involved in the CF community right now because they're just kind of the juggernauts of people that contribute to CFML right now. So not to sound like I'm talking bad about Adam and the work he did. I use Taffy on projects here and there. It's a difference of one person being able to be reached versus a team of 5 or 6 people on the Ortus side that are able to be reached if you have a problem. And they both work pretty well. They both give you a nice structure. Actually, now that I'm saying it out loud and thinking about it, I would go with the ColdBox REST app because it gives you more of an MVC structured approach to your API, whereas Taffy gives you an easy way to build endpoints. Here we go. Let's back up, Michaela. I'm going to back up and revise my answer. If you have a legacy-ish code base, old .cfm files, or maybe the odd CF component that you're not quite sure how to turn into a full-blown MVC app yet, Taffy might be the easier way to get an API up and running that's got some API structure to it. If you're a little bit more well-versed in MVC, or you just know that you need to go that route anyway, and so you want to kind of head that direction with your API as well, the ColdBox REST project is probably a little bit better long-term solution for that sort of thing. My opinion.
Okay. Now you mentioned MVC. I've also read about MVVM. Do you know what that is, or how that fits in? Or?
Sure. So MVVM is more like MVC is model view controller. You've got your model is like the data model part. That's where all your data is stored. So your database stuff, any code that talks to an XML file, saves to a flat file, big chunks of your business logic that do validation before saving to those things. That's all your model stuff. And your view code lives on the other side. And that's the code people actually view in their web browser. The buttons they see on the screen, the graphics, the links, paragraphs of text, that's your view. And the controller sits between the two and sort of manages those things. When the user clicks on a certain link, the controller says, the user clicked on the list new employees button. I need to go have the model return me the list of new employees and hand that off to the screen so it can be drawn in the view. With a model, that's an MVC project. And Angular 1 is an MVC type of project. You have a view layer, you have a model layer, and you have a controller that sits between the two and sort of connects those together. If you look at the code in an MVC JavaScript app like Angular 1, it's real similar to the code in an MVC app from something like Framework 1 or ColdBox or even things like Model Glue, if people are familiar with that. MVVM stands for Model View View Model. And the idea there is there's no controller. You've got a model and you've got a view, and they're connected together directly. And whenever data in one of them changes, the data automatically gets updated in the other side. So if I have a view where I'm typing things into a form field, if those fields on the web page map up to data in my model, as I'm typing into that form field, it's automatically updating the code in the JavaScript model side. I don't have to press a save button. I don't have to reload the web page. The two just are automatically always in sync. So any changes I make here in the view automatically go into the model. And on the same side, if I have business logic running here that changes those values in the model, those values will automatically be reflected in the view over here too. Again, I don't have to hit save or refresh or anything to make those changes appear. Just the two sides are more directly linked together. There's no controller between the two passing data back and forth. So MVC and MVVM are very similar data patterns. MVC is used more in the Angular 1 stuff, and I'd say MVVM is more the way Angular 2 and above is kind of mapped out. There might be some purists out there that maybe want to split hairs with me on some of that, but that's generally how I would describe the code.
Okay, so if you're doing all this object-based stuff on the front end and the back end, do you have to worry about dependency injection at all, or all the things get instantiated? Or?
That's a good question. So on you could basically on the Angular 2 side, or on the Angular 1 or 2 side, part of turning different functionality on in Angular will be done through dependency injection. So on the ColdFusion end of things, dependency injection is usually its own framework you install and start using, something like ColdSpring or Wirebox or DI1. And you actually download those things and install them and configure them in your ColdFusion app. And then you write lines of code that are specific to Wirebox or DI1 to say, hey, Wirebox, go get me this library and make it available in my code, or go turn this function on and make it available in my code. And the way it works in Angular is much more simple than that. You basically have, I don't have code in front of me to show you, but essentially what you do is, like, at the top of your Angular chunk of code, you'll have a variable that is just, it's an array of names of libraries. And these are the libraries of JavaScript code that I want to have available in whatever the chunk of code is I'm writing within. It could be a controller or a model, some function inside one of those sections of my Angular app. You basically just have an array. You put the names of the different things you want to have available in there, and that makes it work in Angular. So it's the equivalent of, like, on the DI1 side, you have the get bean call. You say get bean, and then you pass it something like user service to get back the user service component and turn that on and off. And in Angular, instead of saying get bean user service, you just have these brackets for an array. You type user service in the middle of there, and then Angular knows how to use that name and say, oh, I need to go find the user service in whatever other .js files I've loaded up or whatever other .TypeScript stuff I've compiled, and make that class available to the calling chunk of code. So short answer, yes, you'll use dependency injection. On the JavaScript Angular side, it's really, really seamless. It's just kind of baked into Angular. You have an array somewhere in your code. You put the name of the thing you want in that array, and then Angular takes care of the rest for you.
Okay, that sounds cool. Now, if you've got a really heavy-duty app that's getting a lot of traffic, would you recommend using the Adobe ColdFusion API Manager on the back end, or to, like,
you could, yeah,
what's going on? Or?
You could use the API Manager to keep track of what's going on. I guess before that, before I went to the point of installing a new thing like an API Manager, Let's assume like we're having problems with our apps. Let's go over that point of like we're looking at possible solutions because we're having an issue with the app. What I would probably first do is look at the performance of the server with something like Fusion Reactor and figure out, okay, where is the actual performance problem happening? It could be something that the API manager helps resolve. Excuse me. It could also be something that maybe is fixed by just turning on better caching options within ColdFusion or within some other layer of your server. But if it turns out, yes, we're just getting a metric ton of API requests and we need something to manage that, or we have 5 or 6 different entities managing our API, or that we need to kind of consolidate all together into one spot, then yeah, something like the API manager might be a solution worth checking out, and that would help. If not speed up the application, it might help just organize the application quite a bit and make it easier to track which API endpoints are getting the most traffic, which ones might be causing the most bottlenecks, which places in our app we might want to introduce throttling and then charge customers more for. You'll get a lot of that sort of analysis out of the API manager for sure.
Yeah, and also provides security on your API and versioning and a whole bunch of other things. If you're sharing it out, not just in the Angular front end, but you're sharing it out to third parties, so they can have their own front end to it. So a lot of benefit to that. So before we change gears and ask some questions about ColdFusion, is there anything else on ColdFusion and Angular you want to share?
Nothing comes to mind. I think I think a lot of people, there's a wide variety of ColdFusion developers out there. Some are writing very modern CFML apps with lots of APIs and lots of front-end heavy JavaScript applications, and other people that are writing more legacy CFML apps out there. And I feel like people often are getting bewildered by how fast Angular comes out with new versions of code out there. And the Angular hardcore developers don't like to admit it, but Angular 1 is still supported by Google, and it will be supported for 2 more years. So if you are brand new to that stuff and it still kind of freaks you out, check out Angular 1.6 and install that. It's much easier to start using, so you can kind of check out what Angular does and build your first single-page application with less of a learning curve and not get scared quite so bad. So I think that's probably the best takeaway for people that are maybe not up on all the latest and greatest JavaScript stuff.
Right, great. And probably check out Jeffrey's book as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Looks like it's and I'll put that in the show notes on the TeraTech site, along with all the other resources you mentioned. So let's just ask some other questions about ColdFusion, which is, the first one is, why are you proud to use ColdFusion? It's 2018. Some people think ColdFusion's a little old in the tooth, but obviously you're still excited about using it. Why are you so proud of using it? I
am. I still like using it. So I run a consultancy for a living. Clients will often come to me. I give the same answer every time we talk to you. Clients come to me and ask me to solve a problem for them. Here's the app we want built. What do you think the best way is to build that? And I'll try to be really objective about what makes the most sense. And if I'm looking at the technology stack for what I'll call a traditional web app, there are obviously exceptions to every rule, but for the standard web app, which is what most people really want built, 9 times out of 10, CFML is the easiest way to go. I get the most bang for my buck per line of code. I get more done out of the box than I do with tools like .NET or PHP. It just works. It saves me, there's less code to type, there's fewer third-party things I have to include. It just works really well. And in the spots where I do get stuck and have a question about something, everyone I've met in the community has been really, really supportive. We've got a great CFML ColdFusion community. It's easy to get questions answered. It's easy to find the solution you need and be productive.
Great. So, I alluded to there that, ColdFusion's, I guess it's 23 years old. I think it was originally created in 1995 by the Allaire brothers, before Macromedia and Adobe sequentially bought it. And some people think that ColdFusion's, dying, which from what I've seen, all the conferences this year, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I just wrote a book on it, and it's been a bestseller for the last month. So my question to you is, what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year?
I think it does. I think you're right. It seems to be doing well. My opinion is, rather than having a lot of junior, middle, and senior developers, I think what I'm seeing more of are the senior developers are doing really, really well, and there's more junior developers kind of checking it out for the first time. That middle group of people might be the group that's shrinking a little bit, but at the same time that's shrinking, I think the people that are doing ColdFusion at the senior level are doing leaps and bounds more stuff with it than they were 5 years ago. To make it more alive, that's a great question. I think I would like to see somehow the perception that it is dying lessened, and I'm not sure of a great way to do that, short of kind of rebooting the entire thing and giving it a new name, which is kind of a drastic measure of it. It'd be nice to see more. I'd like to see more CFML ColdFusion apps behind some of the bigger projects at Adobe, like powering more of the Creative Cloud stuff. I'm not sure why they've used a variety of technologies. I'd like to. I know they've got a few CFML sites that are running over there. I'd like to see more of those. As far as the community level of things go, we could probably have more open source apps written that are useful for other people. Like in, let's say 10, 15 years ago, we had things like Lighthouse, which was the bug tracking app that Ray Camden wrote, and Blog CFC. There was also, there were one or two other blog engines I can't think of the names of right now. There have been a few of them. Mango Blog, that was one. We've had a few open source apps that have done a lot to help power, small-ish blogs and websites and other CFML-based things over the years. Personally, I'd like to see more of that sort of stuff. Have more people contribute to open source projects of their own, not just fixing bugs in things like ColdBox or Wirebox, which is great. I'm not saying don't do that, but come up with a pet project in CFML and build a website that does it. They don't have to be the next WordPress killer. If you have an idea for a web app that lists your favorite rock concerts, build that and put it on GitHub so people can check it out. If you have an idea for building a blog powered by a blog software powered by ColdBox or something, then put that out there and share it with the community. Just show people, like, look at how much I was able to do with such little amount of code, and share it with the rest of the world. I think things like that will help move ColdFusion forward.
I think those are great suggestions, Nolan, and maybe on an easier thing for people to get started, just social share about the cool thing you did this week with ColdFusion. Maybe share a code snippet, or if you have a blog about it, and share, hey, this is what I learned about this cool feature, and this is what I did with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or even just have a conversation with other people, because I have conversations every week with ColdFusion developers and ColdFusion managers, and some of them are like, they didn't even realize ColdFusion was still around and thriving. So, it's by all of us having conversations that we can change that perception. So.
Yeah, so when I hear that part of it, I didn't think ColdFusion was still around. I feel like that's not always a representation of where ColdFusion is in the market space right now, as much as that's just a representation of that person doesn't keep up on what ColdFusion is doing. Like, I'm not the right person to express opinions about what other languages are doing that I don't keep up on. Like, I'm not as well versed in what the Groovy and Grails community does right now. So I couldn't, if someone asked me about that, I might respond with, I don't know, are they still around? Because I don't keep up on it. Whereas they could have come up with a new version of something last week that does amazing things. And because ColdFusion started as a non-open source platform, and it was non-open source for so long before we had options like Lucy and Rilo, I think it has that reaction from a lot of people that don't look at that community very often. And it, for a long time, was a harder community to look into because it was so closed off. It's a little bit better now with things like Lucy out there doing much better. But yeah, I think I've always felt like that's more just, I'm going to sound a little bit crass when I say this, but that's more like an example of ignorance on the part of the person making the comment than it is a representation of where CFML is at currently. Because it really is, it's great, it's modern. We got new versions of Adobe and Lucy within the last couple of months. They both do great things that the previous versions didn't. I still think I can get more done with one line of CFML than I can with one line of pick your favorite other backend web language.
Well, Rilo started in 2002, so actually, that's been around for there's been an alternative non-commercial version for longer than there's been just only a commercial version. But I think that news hasn't got out there.
Yeah, that's true.
Is out there, and it's free open source version of ColdFusion. They just released version 6, right, at CF Camp in
I think they announced
Germany.
it, but they didn't release it. They said it's coming.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's switch to talking about conferences. I know you were speaking recently at Adobe ColdFusion Summit in Las Vegas and then CF Camp in Munich.
Yes.
So tell us what you enjoyed about each of those.
See, they were both, let's see, the Adobe conference in Vegas was obviously very Adobe CF centric. They focused a lot on the new version of ColdFusion 2018 that just came out. And for me as a developer, I really liked getting all of the new information about that. It's got lots of features that I, as a developer, will be able to benefit from in the code. New things like upwards for closures and run async, so I can write more asynchronous code, build a little bit more of a modern technology stack that matches modern JavaScript frameworks. Things like the null keyword are in there now. And for someone like me that has an OO background in C++, they're adding several new object-oriented features like abstract and final that C++ and .NET and Java have had for a long time, and now we have them in CFML as well. So I like that I can think more similar to how I would build a C++ or Java app in CFML. If I need to go down to that level of OO specificity, I have more options to do that now in CFML than I did previously. So things like that were the big takeaways for me at the Vegas conference. Another favorite talk was at that conference was also Brian Kloss gave a talk on using ColdFusion to power Amazon Web Services and build different bits of functionality off of AWS into his apps, and scheduling all of that and powering some of that code in his app with CFML. So that's always really good to see. Brian does a great job presenting that information every time I see him. In Germany at CF Camp, it was a little more half and half. There was an Adobe presence there. Rakshith was there and talked about a lot of the new stuff in CF 2018. Gave a similar talk to the one he gave in Vegas and showed here's abstract and final and run async, a lot of the new OO stuff that they've added into the later versions of ColdFusion. The Lucy guys were also obviously there and showing some of the new features they've added into Lucy 5.3, whatever the latest Lucy license is, and they talked about Lucy 6 coming out as well. And it's just good to see both engines at the Germany conference talking about the new features that they've been adding. I feel like having the two CFML engines out there sort of quote unquote competing with each other helps move them both forward in really good directions. They're both looking at what the other one is doing, hopefully, and trying to make sure that they add features that are similar to what the other platform is adding, and then also adding new things that are, something to differentiate themselves from the other platform as well. And the Germany community is just great. I've been to the CF Camp in Germany, I think 4 times now, and I always have a great experience there. That conference has actually grown several times in the last 5 years. They've had to change venues, I think twice in 5 years, because they keep outgrowing the space they had previously. I talked to Michael that runs the CF Camp conference, and I think he said last year they had attendance of about 130, and this year it was up to like 165 or something. So not as big as the 500 people at CF Summit, but percentage-wise, that's a pretty decent jump from the previous year.
Yeah.
The new hotel and venue they have for CF Camp in Germany is great too. I really like the layout. I like where they're at now. Staff were super friendly. Food, the venue, the presentations were all really top-notch. There's talk of this coming year, so 2019 CF Camp, I think it's going to be the 10th CF Camp, and they're talking about stepping it up even more, trying to have bigger rooms and more people and more surprises for the 10th anniversary. And so I'm really looking forward to that, and hopefully going back to Germany again to speak at CF Camp next year.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. We were there interviewing people, and it definitely seems to have grown. And it really, although it's located in Munich, Germany, a lot of people came from other countries in Europe as well. So, and even from the United States. So.
Yeah, there were several of us from the US over there.
Yeah. So, and one of the things I did, I was at CF Summit this year, and I released my new book, CF Alive: Making ColdFusion Modern, Vibrant, and Secure. And I want to thank you for being one of the people I interviewed on that book. So helping and all the things you do in ColdFusion world to help make things more modern.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and it was my pleasure to be part of the book. I'm flattered that you asked. It was great to be a part of that.
Yeah, great. Well, hope you have a great Thanksgiving, and for those in America who celebrate Thanksgiving, hope you also have a great Thanksgiving. And maybe it's a good time to think about what are we grateful for in the ColdFusion community and with the ColdFusion language as well. So I know I'm certainly very grateful for all the things I've been able to do with it. So cool. Well, thanks for being on the show today. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
And thanks everyone for watching and sharing the broadcast with other people. You can subscribe on iTunes or on YouTube.